There's a quiet realization happening with a lot of people in their 20s right now, and it's not being talked about honestly enough. A lot of Gen Z is starting to realize something very uncomfortable. We were never really expected to become wealthy, not in the way that the previous generations could, not easily at least. For years, the message was very simple: go to school, get good grades, graduate, get a job, and work your way up. That's it. That was the working formula for 30, 40, 50 years. Okay. That formula worked reasonably well for a very long time because if you had the higher education, the degree, you were earning substantially higher than somebody who did not have it. Okay. Millions of people built a stable life following that exact formula because you could graduate college, get a normal job, and eventually buy a house, support a family, save money, and build something over time. But somewhere along the way, that equation stopped working the same way for us. And Gen Z, I'm 23, Gen Z is the first generation that grew up watching the gap happen in real time. Because when you start looking at the numbers, something just feels a little bit off. Housing prices keep climbing, rent keeps climbing, groceries cost more, cars cost more, everything feels more expensive than it did even 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the average salary for someone starting their career hasn't increased at that same pace. What's with that disconnect? So you have this strange situation where people are doing exactly what they were told to do, but the outcome looks very different than it used to. Someone graduates college with $100,000 in student loans, they get a normal job, they try to save money, and then they start looking at housing prices in their areas, and that's usually when the shock hits because they have to pay off the loans and now they're seeing how overpriced and ridiculously expensive the real estate is. And then it's like a double whammy to your face. The math just doesn't make sense. Houses that used to cost $200,000 are now $500,000 or more, depending on where you live. Rent that used to be $800 is now $1,800. The interest rates fluctuate. Right now, they're very high. Down payments are massive. And suddenly, the normal path starts feeling like it leads to permanent financial pressure instead of stability. That realization hits a lot of people somewhere in their early 20s. Usually when they get their first job, I would say, is when that reality actually hits that like, oh crap, everything is really expensive. And it creates two types of reactions. You have the camp of people that feel discouraged because they assume that the system is completely broken and there's no point in trying to get ahead. But then you have another camp of people that have a very different reaction. They look at the situation and think, okay, if the traditional path isn't working the same way anymore, then I need a different strategy. They're thinking outside of the box that the school system designed them to think in. And that's where something very interesting is happening with Gen Z, because this is the generation that grew up with the internet, not just casually using it, actually understanding it. We grew up watching people build businesses online, creators, entrepreneurs, developers, people building entire careers from their laptops. And 10 or 15 years ago, that idea sounded unrealistic, but now it happens every day. And when you combine that with the rising cost of living, it creates a kind of pressure that previous generations didn't experience in the same way because the stakes feel higher. If you just drift through your 20s financially right now, catching up later becomes extremely difficult. It's not impossible. It's never impossible. It just becomes harder. So why would you want to do that to yourself? Like a lot of young people are starting to realize that if you want a financial freedom in the future, you probably are going to need to build something outside of just a normal job, whether that be a business, a skill that pays extremely well, fostering an audience, purchasing investments that will appreciate in value, stocks, crypto, real estate, whatever it may be, just something that gives you leverage. And that is why you are seeing so many people in their early 20s experimenting with different things right now. Starting YouTube channels, learning high income skills, launching small businesses. From the outside, it might look chaotic, and it probably is. But, I think underneath that chaos is a deeper realization for Gen Z that just, people are learning to adapt. We're not complaining. It is the way it is. Obviously, it's easy to complain, but we're like actually trying to do something about it. Gen Z is recognizing that the economic landscape is different than it was before, And when people bring up events like the 2008 financial crisis, it's interesting to think about how different that experience is for someone in their 20s today. Because if you're 23 or 24, like I am, I'm 23, but if you're like in this age, you know, I was a child when that happened. So I didn't experience it as an adult trying to buy a home or having investments at the time. It's something that I heard about later, that the, '08 crash, but I was just a kid. I was playing with Lego, I was playing with Pokemon cards, all that fun stuff. Watching the Cartoon Network, like that is what I was doing during the '08 crash. Everyone says it's a historical event, but the cost of living pressure happening now, like that's real time. That's my rent, that's groceries, your future home. Like it just feels so much more immediate and much more personal. And I think that pressure is quietly shaping how the generation of today is thinking about money. Instead of assuming that stability will appear automatically, more people are realizing they need to actively build it. And that is actually a pretty powerful mindset if you look at it the right way, because the internet has created opportunities that simply just didn't exist before. Because you could learn, like I mentioned, the skills online, you could reach global audiences, you could start businesses today with extremely low startup costs. And there's just so many things that you could do. Whereas 25 years ago, most of those paths just didn't exist for the average person. But the average person today could take advantage of those things if they so choose to do so with their time. You know, I think that shift is just massive. And ultimately, people who are treating their 20s like a training ground for the rest of their life, they have understood the meaning of life, because the earlier that you build momentum financially, the easier life becomes later. Money compounds, your skills compound, opportunities compound, just everything in your life, it accelerates. And when I say compound, if you don't know what that means, it's basically like a snowball. It's very difficult to build a snowball, but then once you roll it down a hill, it will grow bigger on its own. And just all of that effort that you are putting in will help you out. So basically, the people who start snowballing or stacking these things early, they are going to end up in a significantly better position 10 years down the road, because it doesn't happen immediately. It takes a lot to get that initial ball rolling. But that's why, for the moment, with Gen Z, it's super interesting, because on one hand, the traditional path feels harder than it used to, but on the other hand, the tools available to build wealth have never been more accessible. And that combination is creating a generation that's slowly waking up to a different approach. Instead of assuming stability will just appear automatically if you follow the, 5 step simple formula of going to school, getting a degree, and working a job, I think more people are realizing that they just need to create it themselves. And that realization could feel intimidating at first, but it could also be incredibly motivating, because once you stop expecting the system to just hand you a comfortable life, you start focusing on what you could do and then following your interests, your passions, and everything like that. And, the people who end up having the most interesting life are the ones who are just starting earlier. They just stop waiting and they finally get around to experimenting, learning, and that momentum, once it starts forming, like I've talked about in other videos, it just gets insane, you guys. It gets absolutely insane, because the earlier that you start with anything, you are just giving it more time to grow, okay? Like, don't be surprised that somebody who planted a seed to grow a cherry tree 10 years ago has a established, well-grown cherry tree, whereas you're just starting out. Yours isn't going to grow right away. Whereas he, 10 years already, every season, he gets to enjoy the fruit of the labor of planting that seed. So ultimately, what you need to do is start as early as you can. The best day was yesterday. The second best day is today. Taking action immediately. You should immediately feel this sense of urgency. And I think a lot of people in their 20s are feeling that sense of urgency. It's not panic. It's not. What it is it's awareness. It's awareness to what's going on, and that nobody is going to change our future unless we do it ourselves. And Gen Z is doing an extremely good job at noticing that, because what you'll find as well is, even just looking at a political standpoint, it doesn't matter what side of the coin you're on, Republican, Democrat, that doesn't matter. You still need to go to work every day. It doesn't matter who they pick as the next president. Your situation is still the exact same, regardless of that outcome. So, focus on the things that you could control. And taking action, well, That's entirely in your control, you know. Ultimately, though, it's going to punish people who just drift and do nothing, which is why I'm making these videos. I want to help as many people as I can. Ultimately, the question isn't really whether the system was designed for you to become rich. The real question is whether you're willing to build something anyways. That is what I want you guys to take away from this video. If you found any use in it, if you enjoyed it, if this was a good listen, make sure to subscribe, like. I got a lot more videos coming, but yeah, this need to be said. Overall, Gen Z, I think they're becoming aware, and that's incredible to see. Until the next one, you guys.